Hey there, I'm Kay, and welcome back to True Asian Nightmare. If today was one of those days that just took everything out of you, I want you to know it's over now. You can drop the worries, the overthinking, and the heavy stress right here. This is your time to just breathe. Let my voice be your company for the rest of the night. If you find a strange sense of comfort in these true scary stories, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a quick like on the video and consider subscribing with the bell on. That way, there will always be another nightmare waiting for you every other night. Before we step into the dark, I'd love it if you shared in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. It's always so comforting to think that someone else, halfway across the world, might be sharing this exact same quiet moment with you. So, lay back, lower the screen brightness, get as comfortable as you can, and let's begin. Driving an 18-wheeler across Australia isn't exactly a glamorous job. It's mostly just you, the heavy hum of the diesel engine, and thousands of miles of absolutely nothing. I've spent half my life in that cabin, and I'm the kind of guy who only believes in what's sitting right in front of his headlights. People talk about highway ghosts and weird sightings out in the bush, but I always chalked it up to sleep deprivation, just the brain playing tricks when you've been staring at the endless white lines for 12 hours straight. I really, really wish it was just my brain playing tricks that night. But what I saw was as real as the heavy leather steering wheel, tightly gripped in my sweating hands. This happened about 10 years ago, when I was doing a massive haul of tomatoes from a remote farm all the way to a processing plant, which was roughly a 1,000-kilometer stretch across the country. Now, the law down there is pretty strict about these extreme long-haul routes, and it dictates that for any trip over 1,000 kilometers, you absolutely must have a co-driver in the cab with you to swap shifts and keep things safe. But things were screwed up from the start, because both of the usual guys I partnered with had emergencies and bailed on me at the absolute last second. I sat there in the sweltering midday heat, smelling the sweet heavy scent of overripe tomatoes baking in the cargo trailer, and I just made a really stupid, arrogant decision. I figured, what the heck, I'll just run it solo. I told myself that the absolute worst case scenario was getting pulled over by the highway patrol and eating a fine of maybe $100 or $200, which seemed like a totally fair trade-off for not losing the massive shipping contract. I fired up the rig right around noon and hit the freeway, feeling pretty confident as the miles just melted away under my tires. The plan was smooth until I started approaching Melbourne, Victoria, a sprawling coastal city where the concrete highways just seemed to tangle into endless, frustrating knots of traffic. By the time I hit the outskirts, it was already past 7 or 8 at night, and the heavy, crushing fatigue of driving a beast of a machine for 8 hours straight was really starting to settle behind my eyes. I was just looking for a clear stretch to maybe pull over and catch an hour of sleep, but as soon as I merged onto the main bypass, traffic just stopped dead. I'm talking a complete parking lot. Way up ahead, I could see the flashing blue and red strobes painting the concrete barriers, and it looked like a massive, horrific pileup involving 3 different semi-trucks that had essentially jackknifed and completely barricaded all the lanes. I rolled my window down, and the deafening thwump 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 of medical evacuation helicopters beating the night air just echoed over the endless sea of idling cars. I knew right then and there I was going to be stuck for hours. I felt this rising tide of frustration and anxiety, so I reached over and grabbed my old clunky sat-nav device. This was years before everyone had fancy smart maps on their phones, and started desperately scrolling around the digital terrain looking for a way out. That's when I noticed a thin gray line diverging off the main interstate just a few miles back, labeled as an old provincial highway that eventually reconnected to my route about 40 miles further down. It looked like an old, forgotten artery from before the massive modern bypass was built. I didn't even hesitate. I managed to painfully maneuver my massive rig in a wide, illegal U-turn across the grass median, ignoring the angry honks from the cars behind me, and I pointed my headlights toward that old off-ramp, The moment my tires transitioned from the smooth interstate asphalt to the cracked, rough surface of that old highway, the entire atmosphere just shifted. It was like driving straight into a black hole. There were absolutely no streetlights, no reflective markers on the shoulder, and zero signs of human life. It was just an impossibly straight, narrow road, completely swallowed by towering, dense forests on both sides. The isolation was suffocating. Even the sat-nav seemed to realize how wrong this was, because the robotic female voice started aggressively commanding me to return to the route, over and over again. The mechanical return, echoing so loudly in the quiet cab that I actually got pissed off and aggressively reached over to rip the power cord right out of the dashboard. With the silence returning to the cab, the road hypnosis began to set in rapidly. There was absolutely nothing to focus my eyes on, except the small patch of illuminated asphalt in front of me, and it felt like I was floating in a terrible video game where the scenery just endlessly looped. My eyelids felt like they were made of lead. To fight off the creeping sleep, I started deliberately swerving the massive truck slightly left and right, throwing my blinkers on for imaginary lane changes just to keep my limbs moving and my brain engaged, and that's when the swinging started. For years, I had this large, heavy wooden rosary hanging from my rearview mirror. A priest back home gave it to me for protection on the road, and I usually never paid any attention to it, but on this dead, uneven road, the constant vibrations of the truck caused the wooden beads to start swaying back and forth in a wide, rhythmic arc, making a soft but persistent clack, clack, clack sound against the windshield glass. Because the road was so utterly devoid of any visual stimulation, my exhausted eyes kept getting drawn to that swinging pendulum in my peripheral vision. It was literally hypnotizing me, pulling me deeper into a daze, and I felt this sudden, intense wave of nausea and dizziness wash over me. I aggressively grabbed the rosary, yanked it off the mirror, and without even taking my eyes off the road, I reached my arm backward into the sleeper cab behind my seat and dropped it onto the small 12-inch folding table. It was just a flimsy little tray I used for eating instant noodles on long hauls. I heard the heavy wooden cross hit the plastic surface with a dull thud, and I let out a deep breath, trying to focus back on the empty blackness ahead. It couldn't have been more than 60 seconds later. I was cruising at maybe 50 or 60 miles per hour, my high beams cutting a long, harsh cone of light through the dark, when I noticed something hovering on the distant right shoulder. It was just a pale, faint shape, contrasting sharply against the pitch-black wall of the forest. I immediately eased my foot off the accelerator, letting the engine brake engage as my mind struggled to process what the hell I was looking at. A stray animal? A piece of trash blown by the wind? As the distance closed to about 100 feet, the pale shape resolved into a human figure. My heart did a violent stutter in my chest. You have to understand, seeing a pedestrian out here, miles from civilization on an abandoned road in the middle of the night, is enough to make any driver's blood run completely cold. I slowed down to a crawl, maybe 20 miles per hour, my headlights washing over her. It was an old woman. She had to be at least 80 or 90 years old, frail and incredibly hunched over. She was wearing a loose, light blue nightgown that fluttered weakly in the draft of my truck, and her shock of curly, pure white hair practically glowed in the headlights. The most bizarre detail, the thing my brain just instantly locked onto, was the thick reading glasses resting on her chest, attached to one of those beaded lanyards around her neck. She was completely barefoot, stepping onto the rough, debris-filled asphalt, slowly and deliberately walking across the highway, right into my path. My initial, desperate thought was that this was a trap. Some sketchy guys using an old lady with dementia to force trucks to stop so they could hijack the cargo. My hands gripped the wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I hovered my foot over the gas pedal, fully prepared to floor it and plow through whatever ambush was waiting in the dark. But as I rolled closer, practically idling now, she continued her slow, agonizing shuffle across the lanes. Then, she reached the center median. The concrete divider on this old road was massive, designed to block out high-beam glare from oncoming traffic, making it easily 5 feet tall. A normal, healthy adult would have to aggressively scramble and pull themselves up to get over it. But this frail, hunched-over grandmother, she didn't climb. She just gracefully, effortlessly floated upward, One second she was standing on the asphalt, and the next second she executed this impossible, gravity-defying vault, landing perfectly seated right on top of the narrow concrete wall. Her movements were so incredibly fluid and silent, completely devoid of any physical exertion. As I slowly rolled past her, she was sitting there on the wall, her body positioned perfectly parallel to my windshield, and as my massive truck loomed over her, she slowly turned her head, looking straight up into my cabin. Her skin was a pale, sickening shade of porcelain, completely devoid of life, and she smiled. It wasn't a malicious grin, just a soft, polite, almost welcoming smile, and she slowly raised one bony hand and gave me a gentle, casual wave hello, as if we were passing each other in a grocery store aisle. I slammed my foot on the gas, my breathing turning into shallow, desperate gasps. I stared frantically into my rear-view mirror, expecting to see her sitting there in the red glow of my taillights, but the concrete median was completely empty. She was just gone. My brain completely short-circuited. I started loudly talking to myself, aggressively trying to rationalize what I just saw, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, just a combination of exhaustion and highway hypnosis. I told myself that the old woman didn't actually jump, that I just blinked and missed her climbing up. I was trying so desperately to gaslight my own sanity because the alternative was too terrifying to accept. I pushed the truck up to a nervous 50 miles per hour, my eyes darting frantically to every shadow in the trees. Maybe 40 seconds passed. Less than a mile of road. Suddenly, my headlights caught movement on the left side of the road, right by the center median. I panicked. I slammed both feet onto the brake pedal so aggressively that the tires locked up, screeching and smoking against the pavement, throwing my entire body forward violently as the seatbelt dug deep into my collarbone, bruising the skin. The massive rig shuddered and groaned, coming down to a slow, creeping roll. It was her, the exact same old woman in the blue nightgown, but this time, she was walking away from the median, heading back toward the dark forest on the right side of the road. I was trembling so violently I could barely keep my foot steady on the brake. I just slowly rolled forward, my high beams tracking her as she crossed the massive expanse of the 4-lane highway. She moved with that same agonizingly slow, shuffling gait, her bare feet making no sound on the pavement. I watched, completely paralyzed by this primal, suffocating terror, as she reached the wooden barricade fence separating the road from the trees, a fence that was easily waist-high, and she just effortlessly glided over it in one smooth, unnatural motion, instantly disappearing into the thick, black woods. I grabbed my water bottle from the cup holder with shaking hands, spilling half of it down my shirt as I desperately gulped it down. I started loudly reciting the Lord's Prayer, my voice cracking and echoing in the empty cab, begging whatever was up there to protect me from whatever the hell was happening out here. I realized I couldn't stop. Parking on a pitch-black, abandoned highway with that thing out there was a death sentence. I kept the truck moving at an agonizingly slow 20 miles per hour, my eyes wide and burning, constantly scanning the dark. I made it maybe another mile, and then I saw her for the third time. She wasn't on the shoulder. She wasn't by the median. She was right in the middle of the lanes, walking in the exact same direction I was driving, her back turned to me. All the rationalization, all the denial, it just evaporated in an instant. I knew for an absolute, undeniable fact that no human being could cover that much ground, jumping back and forth across a massive highway in a matter of seconds. This was something deeply, terribly wrong. A surge of pure, unadulterated survival instinct took over. I wasn't going to slow down this time. I aggressively dropped a gear and slammed the accelerator to the floor. The heavy diesel engine roared as I swerved the massive truck into the far left lane, hugging the concrete median as tightly as I physically could to put as much distance between my truck and her as possible. The speedometer climbed. 50, 60, 70 miles per hour. As I blew past her, I instinctively glanced into my right side mirror. She wasn't looking at me. She was just shuffling forward, her back heavily hunched, her arms swinging out wide in this bizarre, unnatural paddling motion. Within 3 seconds, The darkness swallowed her up completely. I was hyperventilating now. My chest felt like it was trapped in a vice. I realized I still had over 20 miles left on this nightmare road before it merged back into civilization, and there was absolutely nowhere to turn around. My panicked brain suddenly remembered the wooden rosary I had tossed onto the table in the sleeper cab. If there was ever a time I needed spiritual protection, it was right fucking now. Without slowing down, I kept my left hand in a death grip on the steering wheel, and I blindly reached my right arm backward between the seats, my hand desperately feeling around the flat, plastic surface of the small folding table. I swiped my hand back and forth, covering every single inch of that tiny 12-inch surface. Nothing. The table was completely empty. A cold spike of dread shot straight down my spine. The table had a raised lip around the edge. There was absolutely no way the heavy rosary could have simply vibrated off, and I knew I hadn't braked hard enough to send it flying forward. It was just gone. The suffocating silence in the cab suddenly felt incredibly heavy, as if the air pressure had changed. Every single instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep my eyes on the road, to not look back, to just keep driving until I hit the streetlights of the city. But human curiosity is a deeply flawed, suicidal thing. I slowly turned my head, looking over my right shoulder into the dark, cramped space of the sleeper cabin behind me. She was there. The old woman in the pale blue nightgown was lying perfectly flat on my mattress. Her body was completely rigid, her arms and legs locked completely straight at her sides like a corpse in a casket. Her face was pointed straight up toward the ceiling of the cab, her eyes wide open and unblinking in the ambient shadows. In that fraction of a second, my brain, completely broken by the trauma, obsessively locked onto the fact that her thick reading glasses had slipped sideways across her chest. The beaded lanyard tangled slightly in the cheap fabric of her gown. The sheer, overwhelming horror of sharing that tiny, enclosed space with an entity that defied all laws of nature finally broke me. I let out this guttural, animalistic scream that tore my throat raw, and before my brain could even process the fact that I was driving a 40-ton missile at 70 miles per hour, my vision tunneled into total, absolute blackness. I completely passed out behind the wheel. When consciousness finally dragged me back, the very first thing I registered was a sharp, throbbing pain radiating up through my calves and thighs. I tried to shift my weight, but my legs felt like they had been beaten with a baseball bat. I groaned, slowly opening my crusty, burning eyes. I wasn't in my truck. I was lying on a dusty wooden floor inside what looked like a rustic barn or a storage shed. The smell of old hay, motor oil, and damp wood filled my nose. I was covered in dirt. My clothes were soaked in a cold, stale sweat, and my entire body felt completely drained, as if I had just run a grueling marathon. "Hey, mate, take it easy," a voice suddenly said. I flinched violently, scrambling backward, until my back hit a stack of wooden pallets. Standing a few feet away were a man and a woman, an Aussie couple who looked to be in their mid-40s, both dressed in worn-out flannel and jeans. The woman was holding a steaming mug of hot milk, looking at me with this mixture of deep concern and intense bewilderment. They slowly approached me, handing me the hot mug, and the warmth of the ceramic against my trembling hands grounded me just a little bit. The husband gently asked me who I was and how the hell I managed to wander onto their isolated farm property in the middle of the night. I sat there, sipping the milk, and the memories of the dark highway, the pale blue dress, and the rigid body on my bed came flooding back with sickening clarity. I started rambling, my voice shaking uncontrollably as I explained that I was a truck driver, that I took a detour onto the old highway because of the accident in Melbourne, and that I had seen an impossible old woman before blacking out behind the wheel. The husband and wife exchanged a very long, very heavy look. The husband crossed his arms, his expression turning serious. He told me that the old highway I was talking about had been officially decommissioned and abandoned for over 5 years. Nobody drove on it anymore. And more importantly, he pointed out that the closest edge of their farm property to that old road was over a mile of dense, unforgiving forest terrain. I desperately tried to explain that I didn't walk here, that I had passed out while driving at high speed, and I begged them to help me find my truck because my entire livelihood, my cargo, and all my paperwork were still inside it. The wife quietly excused herself and walked out of the shed toward the main farmhouse. A few minutes later, she returned, holding a medium-sized, black and white photograph. Her hand was trembling slightly as she handed it to me. "Is this the woman you saw?" she asked softly. I looked down at the photograph, and my stomach plummeted into a bottomless void. It was her. The woman in the photo was a bit younger, maybe in her late 60s, dressed in a sharp suit instead of a nightgown, but the facial features, the curly white hair, the shape of her nose, it was undeniably the exact same woman who had been lying on my bed. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my legs, a fresh wave of panic washing over me. I accused them of being involved, asking if they were ghosts too, if this was all some elaborate sick trap. The husband let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. He told me that they weren't ghosts. The woman in the photo was his grandmother. He explained that his grandparents had lived in Melbourne for decades. His grandfather was actually a long-haul trucker back in the day, driving the massive rigs just like I did. And his grandmother, the woman in the photo, used to ride shotgun with him all the time. She was a tough, fiercely independent woman, and even though she never had a commercial license, she absolutely loved driving those massive 18-wheelers on the open road. He told me he still vividly remembered when he was just 7 or 8 years old. Back in the 90s, she would actually drive the massive rig and take him along for local deliveries. When his grandfather passed away, his grandmother's mental health rapidly deteriorated. She developed severe dementia and became obsessed with the idea that her husband was still alive, waiting for her at their old house in Melbourne. They tried putting her in a high-security nursing home, but she constantly managed to escape, wandering the streets trying to find a bus or a train to take her home. The facility eventually kicked her out because the liability was too high. With no other options, the couple brought her out to their isolated farm to care for her. But one night, she slipped out of the house. The police found her the next morning. She had wandered over a mile through the dense woods in the pitch black, somehow finding her way to the old highway. She was wandering in the middle of the lanes, desperately looking for a way back to Melbourne, when a speeding container truck hit her. The police estimated it happened right around 3 or 4 in the morning. I sat there, the hot milk turning to ash in my mouth. I had driven right through the exact spot where she was killed, on a road she still desperately haunted. And the most messed up part was what the husband told me next. After the police released her body from the hospital, they didn't bury her in some public cemetery. They actually brought her back and buried her right there on that very farm. After I managed to calm down, he offered to drive me in his pickup truck to go look for my rig, and honestly, I was terrified of what we would find out there, fully expecting a mangled wreck wrapped around a tree and my career completely destroyed. We drove out of the farm, navigating this small dirt service road that eventually connected to the abandoned highway. As his headlights swept across the cracked asphalt, my jaw absolutely dropped. My massive 40-ton 18-wheeler was sitting there perfectly in the dark. It hadn't crashed, and it hadn't rolled into the ditch. The huge rig was flawlessly, perfectly parallel, parked flush against the shoulder of the road. The engine was turned off, the parking brake was securely engaged, and there wasn't a single scratch on the bumper. You have to understand the physics of driving an old container truck. It has a manual transmission with a heavy foot clutch, meaning if you pass out and simply take your feet off the pedals, the truck doesn't just coast to a stop. It violently stalls out, jerking and buckling right there in the middle of the road. To pull a rig that size safely to the side requires intense focus, calculated downshifting, and multiple wide steering corrections. It is physically impossible for an unconscious man to execute that maneuver. The husband turned to me, his face looking completely pale in the dashboard light, and quietly reminded me that his grandmother used to love driving those trucks. The horrifying realization finally clicked into place. When I passed out, the entity, the spirit of that old woman, had completely overtaken my body. She used my hands, my feet, my physical form to smoothly press the clutch, downshift the gears, safely park the massive rig on the shoulder, and turn off the engine. And then she literally walked my exhausted body over a mile through the dark woods, bringing me straight back to her family's farm. She didn't want to hurt me. She just needed a ride, and then she needed to go back to her grave. I thanked the couple profusely, my voice choked with a mixture of terror and profound gratitude. The husband told me to be safe, and casually asked if I had a cross or a rosary in the truck, suggesting I hold on to it for the rest of the drive just in case. I told him I did, but that I had lost it during the panic. I walked up to my truck, my legs still trembling from the mile-long possession walk. I opened the heavy metal door, climbed up into the driver's seat, and flicked on the interior cabin light. I slowly turned around to look at the sleeper cab. Sitting directly in the dead center of the small 12-inch folding table, the exact same table I had blindly, frantically swept my hands across without feeling a single thing, was my wooden rosary. It hadn't fallen. It hadn't moved. She had simply, effortlessly hidden it from my touch because she wasn't ready to leave the truck yet. I grabbed the heavy wooden beads, wrapping them so tightly around my knuckles that it hurt, and I fired up the engine. I drove the rest of the way to the processing plant with every single light inside the cab turned on, jumping at every shadow, checking my rearview mirror every 10 seconds. A few days later, after dropping off the cargo, the memory of that family's kindness nagged at me, and I made the decision to take the old highway back to try and find their farm to thank them properly in the daylight. But when I reached the turnoff from the interstate, the entrance was completely blocked. A solid, impenetrable wall of massive concrete barriers had been installed across the ramp, accompanied by bright orange signs declaring the road permanently closed. I sat there in the idling truck, staring at those concrete blocks, realizing the terrifying precision of the universe. If my co-drivers hadn't bailed, if the traffic hadn't jammed, if I had been delayed by even a single day, I would have never taken that road. I would never have seen her. It was a perfect, inescapable alignment of circumstances designed exclusively for me to cross paths with a dead woman still trying to find her way home. I don't really like talking about my first marriage because it's a goddamn train wreck. I was 16, dumb, and obsessed with this guy who was basically the alpha of our small village in Haozhang. We got married way too young, and the second the honeymoon phase ended, he turned into a monster who thought my face was a punching bag. By the time I walked away at 22, I'd lost everything. My dignity, my jewelry, and even my own kid, because I didn't have a cent to my name. My in-laws basically snatched my baby because the law doesn't favor broke mothers. I just sat at the bus station in Saigon and cried until I couldn't feel my face, eating cold sweet potatoes just to survive. I honestly thought my life was just done. No plan, nowhere to go. I was basically just a zombie sitting on a sticky plastic bench, breathing in diesel fumes and feeling sorry for myself. And that was when my current husband found me. He was a long-haul driver, driving one of those massive, loud 2-ton delivery trucks, hauling bricks and construction materials all over the southern provinces. He saw me looking pathetic, offered me a ride, and I was so deeply depressed and exhausted that I didn't even care about my own safety anymore. I just climbed into his massive rig, figuring whatever happened to me couldn't be worse than what I'd already been through. But instead of taking advantage of me, he was kind. He just drove, let me sleep, and eventually, we just kind of clicked. We didn't even have a wedding or anything formal, you know? I had already done the whole traditional marriage thing and it almost killed me, so we just skipped the paperwork and moved into a tiny, cramped rental room together. He is the complete opposite of my ex. He is this stoic, incredibly quiet guy who shows his love through actions, not words. I mean, the man will literally go an entire evening without saying a single sentence to me, but he'll make sure my phone is charged and my favorite snacks are on the table. He is just a solid, good human being. After a few years of saving every single penny and living on practically nothing, we finally managed to buy a house. And when I say house, I mean a rundown, absolute bare-bones cinder block box in the deep suburbs of the city. It was one of those charity builds that the previous owner sold to us for cheap, and we still had to take out a massive bank loan to afford it. Anyone who has ever had a mortgage knows that the financial panic of paying the bank every month is infinitely more terrifying than living in a slum. We were stretched so thin that we had to cut corners everywhere. One of the ways we saved money was on gas. My husband's company paid for the diesel in his work truck, so instead of taking his motorbike for his hour-long commute into the city, he'd just drive the massive brick hauler all the way home and park it right in front of our tiny house. Our alley was just barely wide enough for it, and it blocked half the view, but we didn't care. It was free transportation. Because my shift ended earlier, my routine was always the same. I'd get home about 45 minutes before him, start the rice cooker, prep the vegetables, and listen for the heavy rumbling roar of his diesel engine pulling up. He had this cute little habit where he would walk straight through the front door, smelling like sweat and motor oil, and give me a huge kiss on the forehead before even taking his boots off. It was our little anchor of normalcy, until one evening, the routine just broke. I was in the kitchen, chopping garlic, when I heard the heavy rumble of his truck pull up outside. I heard the air brakes hiss, heard the engine cut off, and then nothing. I waited 5 minutes, then 10, then maybe 15 minutes passed, and the front door still hadn't opened. I wiped my hands on my apron, feeling this sudden spike of annoyance, and walked out to the front yard. The truck was parked there, but he wasn't coming inside. Instead, he was standing on the runner step with a bucket of soapy water, scrubbing furiously. But he wasn't washing the outside of the truck. He was leaning all the way into the cabin, aggressively scrubbing down the passenger seat and the floorboards. My stomach instantly did this horrible, ugly flip. When you've been betrayed as badly as I was in my past, your brain automatically jumps to the absolute worst-case scenario. I didn't think he was just doing chores. I immediately thought he had another woman in there. I mean, why else would a guy who hauls dirty bricks for a living suddenly care about scrubbing his passenger seat with a sponge? Did she spill perfume? Did she leave makeup on the dashboard? I marched up there and passive-aggressively asked him what the hell was so important that he couldn't come inside and say hi to his wife. He just looked at me, looking totally exhausted, and mumbled some weak excuse about the cabin getting muddy and how he was just doing a quick wipe down. He brushed it off so casually, telling me he was starving and asking if dinner was ready. I let it go, but the seed of doubt was already planted in my brain. Over the next week or so, he started having this bizarre string of bad luck. He came home one night, complaining that some lady on a scooter had backed right into his parked truck and smashed his turn signal, costing him a couple $100,000 to fix. A few days later, he was furious because he supposedly rolled over a jagged piece of glass in a totally clear parking lot, shredding his tire completely. He had to pay his company over $2 million, which was roughly $80, and a massive chunk of our grocery budget. He kept grumbling about how the truck felt cursed, how things just kept going wrong for no logical reason. I just thought he was having a bad week. I had no idea that the bad luck was actually a warning sign. About a week after the tire incident, we were dead asleep. Our house was a standard shotgun layout. Living room at the front, our bedroom in the middle, kitchen in the back. At around midnight, I was ripped out of a deep sleep by a sound outside. It was a rhythmic, metallic clicking. Click, clack, click, clack. I lay there in the dark, my brain groggy, trying to place the sound. It was loud. It was the heavy-duty hazard flashers from a commercial truck. And because our alley was a dead end, I knew for an absolute fact that my husband's rig was the only vehicle out there capable of making that sound. I nudged him, but he was completely passed out, snoring softly. The clicking just kept going, echoing against the concrete walls of our neighbors' houses. Click, clack, click, clack. I figured maybe the wiring was short-circuiting because of all the recent damage, or maybe the battery was going to drain and we'd be totally screwed for work the next morning. I dragged myself out of bed, annoyed and shivering a little because the night air was damp, and walked out to the living room. We had this cheap, semi-transparent mesh curtain over the sliding glass front door. I stood in the dark living room, peering through the fabric out into our small yard. The amber hazard lights of the truck were pulsing, illuminating the street in these harsh yellow flashes. And right as the light flashed on, I saw a silhouette in the passenger seat. I froze. My breath literally hitched in my throat. I squinted, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me in the dark. But the light flashed again, and I saw it clearly. It was a person. A woman. She had long, stringy hair, and she was wearing a bright, almost neon-colored jacket that caught the amber light. But the creepiest part was how she was moving. She wasn't just sitting there. She was slumped down beneath the dashboard, and then she would slowly pop her head up to look out the windshield, and then duck back down, up and down, like a twisted game of hide and seek. If this were a movie, this is the part where the main character realizes it's a ghost and runs away screaming. But I am a fiercely jealous woman with severe trust issues. I didn't feel a drop of fear in that moment. I felt pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. All I could think was that my supposedly perfect husband had brought his freaking mistress home, hid her in the truck while I was asleep, and was probably planning to sneak out and hook up with her. I threw the front door open, marching barefoot across the concrete yard. The hazard lights were still flashing, blinding me every 2 seconds. As I got within a few feet of the passenger side door, the woman popped her head up again, but this time, she didn't look out the windshield. She turned her head, slowly, and looked directly past me, staring intensely at our front door. She looked like she was searching for something. Searching for him. That was the last straw. I completely lost my mind. I grabbed the handle of the truck door and yanked it, but it was locked. So I just started slamming my fists against the metal, screaming at the top of my lungs, cursing her out, demanding that the home-wrecking bitch show her face and fight me like a woman. I was banging on the glass so hard I thought it would shatter. The noise woke my husband. The front door of the house banged open, and he came running out in his boxers, looking totally panicked, asking me what the hell I was doing. I screamed at him to unlock the damn door, demanding he show me the girl he was hiding. He looked at me like I belonged in a psych ward, but he fumbled for his keys and unlocked the passenger door. I ripped it open, ready to drag whoever was in there out by their hair, but the cabin was completely empty. There was no one there. The space inside that truck is tiny, barely enough room for a small cooler between the seats. There was nowhere to hide. No secret compartments, just an empty, dusty vinyl seat. I stood there, panting, staring at the empty space. I tried to explain it to him, tried to tell him that I saw a girl in a bright jacket with long hair, but my voice was shaking. He just looked exhausted and annoyed, swearing up and down that he would never cheat on me, let alone hide a girl in a suffocatingly hot, locked truck cabin in the middle of the night. He convinced me I was just having a paranoid nightmare, and eventually, I let him guide me back to bed, but my stomach was tied in agonizing knots. I knew what I saw. About an hour later, I was still wide awake, staring at the ceiling, when my husband started sleep-talking. Now, he never talks in his sleep, but suddenly he started muttering, his voice distressed. He said, and I am not exaggerating, he mumbled something like, "Why are you following me? Look, I already have a wife. Just leave me alone. You don't need to do this." I snapped. I rolled over and slapped him across the face so hard the sound echoed in the room. He jolted awake, clutching his cheek, completely dazed and asking what he did wrong. I demanded to know who he was telling to leave him alone. He looked terrified, realizing what he had just mumbled. He stammered, rubbing his face, and begged me to just let him sleep, promising he would explain everything in the morning. He swore it wasn't what I thought, but when I woke up the next morning, he was already gone. He had a haul down to Camo Province and had left before the sun even came up. I was so livid I called in sick to work. I spent the entire day pacing the house, calling him endlessly, but he wouldn't pick up, texting me that he was driving and couldn't look at his phone. By the time 6 o'clock rolled around, the sun was setting, casting this sickly, dim green light over the neighborhood. The air was incredibly still, not a single breeze. I was sitting in the living room, glaring at the muted TV, waiting for him to get home, so we could have it out, And that's when the curtain covering the window next to the TV suddenly whipped violently up into the air. It wasn't a draft. It looked exactly like someone had grabbed the fabric in their fist and yanked it upwards. It hung there for a second, then dropped. I stared at it, my heart starting to thud against my ribs. 30 seconds later, it happened again. Snap! The curtain flew up, exposing the window. Through the glass, in the dim twilight, I swear to God I saw the silhouette of a person standing right outside my window. Just a dark shape with long hair, perfectly still. I bolted up, ran to the window, and ripped the curtain all the way back. Nothing. Just the empty alleyway. Before I could even process that, a horrific noise erupted from our bedroom. It sounded like someone was taking a heavy, wet towel and violently whipping it against the mattress. Whack, 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 thud. I crept toward the bedroom door and flicked the light on. The entire room had been trashed. Our heavy blanket was balled up on the floor. Our pillows were thrown against the far wall. The fitted sheet had been physically peeled off the heavy mattress. The doors to our cheap plastic wardrobe were flung wide open, and the standing fan we used to keep cool had been violently shoved over, crashing onto the tiles. I stood there, completely paralyzed. Our house had no back door. There was only the front door, which I had locked, and I had been sitting in the living room the entire time. No one could have gotten past me. While I was standing there trying to convince myself that maybe a stray cat had somehow gotten in, a deafening crash came from the kitchen behind me. I heard the distinct, sickening sound of plastic Tupperware being aggressively rummaged through, followed by the sharp crack of a ceramic bowl hitting the tile floor and shattering into 100 pieces. I sprinted down the short hallway to the kitchen. There was no one there. Just the shattered remains of my rice bowl scattered across the floor and the dish rack rocking back and forth on the counter as if unseen hands had just been digging through it. I grabbed a broom, completely operating on autopilot, my brain utterly failing to compute the impossibility of the situation. I swept up the shards, my hands shaking so violently I kept dropping the dustpan. I walked toward the front of the house to throw the glass in the trash bin by the door, and that's when my blood ran entirely cold. The heavy metal front door, which I had deadbolted an hour ago, was standing wide open. The two front windows were also pushed completely open. I didn't try to be brave. I dropped the broom, grabbed my phone, and called my husband, screaming at him to get home right that second because someone or something was in our house. He promised he was only 2 miles away and would be there immediately. I slammed all the doors shut, locked them, turned the TV volume up to max just to have human voices in the room, and lit a bundle of incense on our small altar, praying to whatever was listening to protect me. My husband burst through the door 10 minutes later, breathless. I was a sobbing, hyperventilating mess. I told him everything: the curtains, the bedroom, the shattering bowl. But because he was a deeply pragmatic, stubborn guy who never believed in the paranormal, he just held me and rationalized it all away. He blamed the wind for the doors, a rat for the dishes, and told me I was just exhausted and stressed from our fight. He even took me out to get some late-night food and bought me a new shirt just to shut me up and calm me down, dodging my questions about his sleep-talking from the night before. I desperately wanted to believe him. I wanted to feel safe in my own home, so I let myself be comforted, and we eventually went to sleep. I should have pressed him for the truth. If he had just told me what happened then, maybe the nightmare wouldn't have escalated. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with that heavy, suffocating feeling you get when you know you aren't alone in a room. You know that instinct? The primitive alarm bell in your brain that tells you eyes are on you. I blinked in the darkness, turning my head slightly on the pillow. My husband was sitting up in bed, right beside me, but he wasn't sitting like he normally did. He was sitting with his legs daintily crossed, tucked underneath him to the side, a posture that his stiff, muscular legs physically couldn't naturally maintain. He was staring down at me in the dark. I mumbled his name, asking him what he was doing. He didn't answer. Instead, he slowly raised his hand and began to stroke his hair. But he didn't have hair to stroke. He had a harsh military buzz cut. Yet his hand was moving in these long, graceful, flowing motions, starting from the crown of his head and pulling all the way down past his shoulder, mimicking the exact motion of a woman brushing out long, heavy hair. "Babe, stop playing around. You're freaking me out," I whispered, reaching out to push his shoulder so he'd lie back down. The second my fingers grazed his skin, he violently swatted my hand away. The slap echoed in the quiet room, and then he spoke. But it wasn't his voice. The vocal cords belonged to him, but the cadence, the pitch, the unnatural inflection, he was forcing his deep, gravelly voice to sound breathy and feminine. "Who is your husband?" he hissed. Before my brain could even register the absolute horror of that sentence, he lunged at me. He pinned me to the mattress and started choking me, but his movements were all wrong. He wasn't punching me like a man in a bar fight. He was slapping me, vicious, open-handed, frantic strikes across my face and chest, scratching at my skin exactly like two women fighting in the street. Getting hit like that it completely messed up my head. It was like my brain just short-circuited and dragged me right back to the trauma with my ex. I stopped seeing my current husband, and in the pitch black, I thought my abusive ex had finally found me. I stopped fighting back. I just curled up into a fetal position, sobbing, begging, "Please stop, I'm sorry, please don't hit me anymore." The beating went on for what felt like an eternity. And then, completely out of nowhere, he froze. The suffocating weight lifted off my chest. I kept my arms over my face, terrified to move. When I finally peeked through my fingers, my husband was slumped against the headboard, gasping for air like he had been held underwater. He looked down at his hands, then looked at my bleeding lip and scratched face. He burst into tears. My stoic, silent husband, who never showed emotion, just started sobbing hysterically, scrambling to grab a bottle of medicated oil to rub on my bruises and wipe the blood off my face. He kept apologizing, saying he had no idea what just happened, that he couldn't control his own body. I recoiled from him, screaming at him to get away from me, calling him a psycho. He dropped to his knees right there on the bedroom floor, pressing his forehead against the cheap tiles. "I'm sorry," he sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I'm being followed. A ghost followed me home." I just stared at him, my lip bleeding, the room spinning. He sat there on the floor and finally confessed the truth. The day he came home late and washed the inside of his truck, he had been driving back through Long in Provence. A young girl, maybe early 20s, driving a scooter without a helmet, had blindly swerved out of an alleyway, but she didn't hit him. She smashed face first into the truck, driving right in front of him. He said she was thrown onto the pavement, just totally mangled and coughing up blood while the other driver was in shock. So, being the guy he is, he didn't wait for an ambulance. He jumped out, picked her up, put her in the passenger seat of his truck, and sped toward the nearest hospital, running red lights with his hazards on. But she didn't make it. She died right there in the passenger seat, bleeding out onto the vinyl, about 10 minutes before they reached the emergency room. He didn't tell me because he didn't want to traumatize me. He just washed the blood out and tried to forget it. But because she died in his vehicle, her spirit latched onto the truck. And because he drove the truck directly to our house and parked it out front, she followed him right to our doorstep. He admitted that he had been having terrifying dreams all week, dreams where he was driving, and she would suddenly appear in the passenger seat, telling him that since he tried to save her life, she wanted to repay him by becoming his wife. In the dreams, he kept telling her he was already married, and that's exactly what I had heard him sleep-talking about. She didn't accept his rejection. She destroyed his tire, smashed his blinker, and finally, out of sheer jealousy, she entered our home to eliminate the woman she saw as her rival, me. The next morning, we didn't even go to work. We drove straight to a highly respected monk at a temple in the city. The monk listened to our story and shook his head, explaining that because the girl died a violent, sudden death on the road, he couldn't just perform a simple banishment. Her spirit was incredibly volatile. He told us we had to go back to the exact location of the accident to appease her. My husband loaded a small statue of the Buddha into his truck cab. He actually told me something that made a weird kind of sense. He said, "Hey, if she's sitting in the truck with us right now, that's actually a good thing. We can just drive her back. The only thing we should be terrified of is if she stayed behind in the house." And with that, I white-knuckled the door handle the entire drive down to Long An. When we arrived at the intersection where she was hit, my jaw dropped. There was a family setting up a small offering table on the side of the road. We approached them, and it turned out to be the girl's mother and younger sister. It was exactly 2 weeks since the accident, the second spiritual week of her passing. We told her family everything. The mother just wept, begging her daughter's spirit to come home. We went with them back to their house, which was terrifyingly only 500 meters away from the crash site. We offered incense at her altar, prayed at her grave behind the house, offered food at the side of the road where she fell, and finally, stopped at the hospital where she was pronounced dead. At every single stop, my husband bowed his head and pleaded with her. He told her he was deeply sorry for her tragic fate, that he only wanted to help her in her final moments, but that he had a family to protect and she could not follow him anymore. It's been years now. We actually have a kid of our own, and things are back to normal. Well, as normal as they can be after your husband gets possessed by a dead girl. We finished all the rituals at the 4 locations like the monk said, and it worked. We even went to her first anniversary feast a year after it happened, just to be respectful, though we haven't been back since. It's crazy, right? My husband still drives that same truck, but now he has a small Buddha statue on the dash. He told me that about 3 or 4 years after the accident, he was driving past that exact same spot, and he saw that the locals had actually built a small granite shrine right there on the side of the road where he picked her up. There was incense burning and everything. I guess she was really active around there, you know. So yeah, he always honks his horn 3 times when he passes it now. He says it's for her and for us, to make sure everyone gets home safe this time. If you're driving for a rideshare app right now, especially if it's past midnight, do me a favor and pull over for a second. Turn off the engine, just listen. I'm telling you this not to scare you, but as a warning from a guy who learned the hard way. The things I experienced driving my motorbike back in the early 2000s. Man, it's not just some spooky campfire story. It's a goddamn survival guide, because the dark corners of this city haven't changed. They just got better at hiding. Look, I need to give you some context so you understand that I am not, and have never been, a superstitious guy. Back in my hometown, when I was a teenager, I was that reckless idiot who would go out into the local graveyards in the pitch black just to catch field mice. I didn't care about spirits or curses or any of that crap. I was tough, I was stubborn, and I thought the physical world was the only thing that could actually hurt you. Then, my wife Brianna and I moved to Saigon around 2002 to try and make a living. She got a job in a garment factory, working herself to the bone. And well, my temper meant I couldn't hold down a regular job. I couldn't handle bosses breathing down my neck. So, out of sheer desperation, Brianna convinced her family back home to sell a small plot of land just so we could buy a decent Japanese wave motorbike. The plan was simple. I was going to be a motorbike taxi driver, a 2-wheeled cab basically. If you think driving an Uber is stressful now, you have no idea what the streets were like back then. It was an absolute jungle. There were no apps, no GPS, just pure territorial warfare. The first 3 or 4 days I tried to work, I came home with my face completely bruised and battered. I'd try to park at a busy intersection or near a bus station, and the local turf gangs, the older drivers who claimed that corner, would literally throw rocks at my bike or just walk up and punch me in the jaw to chase me away. It was humiliating. It was a brutal, exhausting way to scrape by. So, I had to adapt. I realized I couldn't compete during the day, so I switched to the night shift. I started sneaking around, parking in the dark alleys near Tudu Hospital after 9 or 10 p.m., By that time, the city calmed down. The aggressive drivers went home to sleep, and I could actually pick up fares from people leaving the hospital late. And you know what? The money was surprisingly good. I was making a couple of extra bucks a night, which back then was enough for Brianna and me to stash away some solid savings. I felt like I had beat the system. I felt invincible. And then, the 7th lunar month rolled around. Over here, it's known as Ghost Month. It's a time when locals believe the gates of the afterlife just swing wide open and the dead walk among the living. Brianna begged me to stay home. She kept nagging me, telling me it was bad luck to be out on the streets so late during that month. But I just laughed in her face. I told her she was being ridiculous, that this was the best time to make money because all the religious folks were out going to temples and they always tipped better. I was so greedy and so incredibly blind. The first 2 weeks of that month, nothing happened. It was totally fine. I felt so vindicated. But then came the 14th night of the lunar month, the exact peak of the Ghost Festival. I was parked near a bus stop right outside Tudu Hospital. It was a weirdly slow night. I mean, it was dead. I had bought a thick police newspaper, and I just lay back on the seat of my bike, reading that thing cover to cover under the dim orange glow of the streetlights. By the time I checked my watch, it was around, I want to say 12:05 or 12:07 a.m. The streets were completely empty. The silence was heavy, like the thick, humid air was actually pressing down on my eardrums. I was just about to give up and head home, completely frustrated that I hadn't made my quota. Just as I shifted my weight to sit up, I heard this sound. It was the distinct, rhythmic shuffling of someone carrying heavy, clunky plastic bags, like the kind of bags people use when they bring food and supplies to a relative staying in the hospital. I opened my eyes and saw this man walking toward me out of the shadows. He looked completely exhausted. His clothes were all wrinkled and dirty. His hair was a mess. As he got closer, I noticed something else. Trailing right behind him was a little boy, maybe 4 or 5 years old. The kid looked exactly like the man. You could instantly tell they were father and son. But the boy was barefoot, and his clothes were covered in these dark, filthy smudges. I asked the man where he needed to go. He mumbled that he needed a ride all the way to Tankei Street, which was a pretty far haul from where we were. I told him it was going to cost about 40,000 dong, maybe $2, which was a very fair price for a night ride back then. He started negotiating, begging me in this tired, raspy voice to drop it to 35,000 because that was literally all the money he had left in his pockets. I looked at him, then looked at the barefoot kid standing quietly behind him, and I just felt a pang of pity. I agreed to the lower fare. I kicked the stand up and straddled the bike. The man climbed onto the back seat, but the weirdest thing happened next. The little boy didn't get on the back with his dad. He just silently climbed up and sat right in front of me, straddling the space between my arms and the handlebars. Usually, kids only sit up front like that if the back seat is completely packed with passengers. But since it was just the dad riding back there, he had plenty of room. I told the kid to scoot to the back with his dad, because it was dangerous up front. But the boy just sat there, stiff as a board, staring straight ahead. I looked back at the father, expecting him to say something, but the man just sat there in complete silence. He didn't even acknowledge what I said. So I figured, whatever. It's late, I just want to get this over with. I started the engine, and we took off into the dark streets. The wind was whipping past us, and I could see the little boy's hair blowing wildly in the breeze. It was so incredibly tactile, so physically real. I tried to make small talk, just to break the awkward silence. I asked the guy over my shoulder why he dragged his little boy all the way to the hospital so late at night instead of leaving him home. The man leaned in close to my ear, his voice sounding genuinely confused, and asked me what the hell I was talking about. He told me to stop joking around, because he was the only passenger on my bike. My heart did a massive drop into my stomach. I completely froze up. I didn't say another word for the rest of the ride. My brain just immediately went into overdrive, trying to rationalize it. I told myself he was just messing with me, or he was too tired to understand what I asked. I focused solely on the road, aggressively ignoring the little boy sitting mere inches from my chest. We finally pulled up to an old house on Tankei. The street was completely deserted, illuminated by this single, flickering fluorescent bulb. The man climbed off the bike and handed me a crumpled up wad of paper money. He told me to wait a second while he knocked on the door to wake his sister up, because he was afraid of getting mugged standing out there alone. He walked up to the door and started knocking, completely ignoring the kid. I couldn't take it anymore. I put the kickstand down, hopped off the bike, and yelled at the guy, asking him why he was leaving his son sitting on my bike. The man turned around, looked at me with this completely dead, flat expression, and calmly told me again that there was no kid. He pointed at my bike and told me to look for myself. I whipped my head around. The seat was completely empty. There was no little boy, no footprints, nothing. My knees instantly felt like they were made of water. I started shaking violently. I turned back to the man, stammering, demanding to know what the hell was going on, because I swore to God I just drove his son halfway across the city. The man didn't look scared. He actually looked at me with this deep, sorrowful empathy. He took a slow breath and explained that his wife had a miscarriage early in the year and the baby hadn't survived. But ever since then, he said he felt this heavy, crushing weight pressing down on both his shoulders every single day. He had gone to a spiritual healer who told him that his unborn child's spirit was clinging to him. He refused to send the spirit to a temple because he wanted his son to stay with him. He said no one had ever actually seen the boy before, until tonight. He actually looked surprised and asked me if the boy had really sat in the front seat. Right at that moment, the front door swung open and his sister stepped out. She took one look at me, then looked at her brother, and started scolding him for taking a motorbike taxi in the middle of the night during the month of wandering souls. She literally said that picking up hitchhiking spirits was bound to happen. The man just shrugged, told me the spirit was attached to him and wouldn't follow me home, and then they just walked inside and slammed the door. They left me standing there alone on a pitch-black street at 1 a.m, my entire body violently shivering. I didn't even put my helmet back on. I just threw myself onto the bike and sped off, my mind completely fractured. I was so panicked that I took a wrong turn. Keep in mind, there were no smartphones back then. I was just blindly navigating through the dark, and I ended up totally lost, miles away from where I should have been, popping out onto Trung Chin Street in the Tan Binh district. The road was wide and mostly empty, save for a few cargo trucks roaring past. I needed to calm down. I was hyperventilating. I pulled over near a large gas station at a fork in the road. The place was well lit, which made me feel a tiny bit safer. I fumbled in my pockets, pulled out a cigarette, and ducked my head down to light it, my hands shaking so badly I could barely flick the lighter. I took 2 deep drags, the nicotine barely taking the edge off, when a voice right behind my shoulder asked if I was available for a ride. I jumped, nearly dropping the cigarette. I spun around and saw a young guy standing there. He looked maybe 19 or 20. He was wearing a faded button-down shirt, a pair of jeans, and a baseball cap pulled down low over his eyes. But the thing that immediately sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my veins was that he was completely barefoot, just standing on the oily concrete without shoes. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to hit the gas and leave, but the streetlights were bright, and my rational brain, the stupid, stubborn part of me, was trying to regain control. I figured he was just some junkie or a local thug who got into a fight and lost his shoes. I asked him where he wanted to go, keeping my voice as tough as possible. He muttered that he needed to go to Lang Cha Ka, which was a massive traffic roundabout a few miles down the road. I told him it would be 15,000 dong, less than $1. He nodded slowly and agreed. He climbed onto the back. I threw my cigarette away and merged back onto the main road. The street was wide and heavily illuminated, so my fear started to subside just a little bit. We were cruising at a decent speed, but as we got closer to the roundabout, I realized the area was huge, and I needed to know exactly where to drop him. I asked him over my shoulder if he wanted to be dropped off at the beginning of the roundabout or the far side. Total silence. I asked him again, raising my voice over the engine noise, telling him I needed a specific street name, or else I wouldn't know where to turn. Still nothing. Not a whisper. Not a shift in weight. I was so incredibly pissed off at this point. My nerves were absolutely shredded from the earlier incident, and now this punk was playing games with me. I slammed on the brakes and swerved roughly over to the curb. I planted my feet on the ground and twisted my body around, fully prepared to grab him by the collar and throw him off my bike. But when I looked at him, he was just sitting there, perfectly still. He had scooted as far back on the seat as possible. His hands were resting flat on his thighs, and his head was bowed, so low that the brim of his baseball cap completely hid his face. I lost my temper. I started yelling at him, cursing him out, telling him I wasn't playing his freaking games. I told him to give me 10,000 dong for the distance we covered and get the hell off my bike. I must have stood there for 2 solid minutes, screaming at a guy who refused to even flinch. While I was losing my mind, another motorbike taxi driver, an older guy in a thick jacket, pulled up alongside me. He looked at me with disgust and started berating me, asking me why the hell I was driving around drunk during the ghost month, yelling at thin air like a lunatic. I snapped back at him, pointing furiously at my back seat, telling him I wasn't drunk. I was just trying to kick this stupid kid off my bike because he wouldn't tell me where to go. The old man squinted at my bike. He looked at me, then looked at the seat, his face suddenly dropping all its anger, replaced by this horrifying pale realization. He asked me, very quietly, what exactly I was carrying. I turned around to point at the kid's face. The seat was empty. There was absolutely no one there. I swear to God, the air in my lungs just vanished. I staggered backward, the bike almost falling over. I started babbling to the old man, telling him I just picked the kid up at the gas station down the road, describing his clothes, his hat, his bare feet. The old man slammed his hand against his handlebars. He swore loudly, asking me exactly where I picked him up. When I told him it was right at the tip of the concrete divider by the gas pumps, the old man went dead silent. He told me, in this low, trembling voice, that just a few days ago, a young guy matching that exact description was walking barefoot across that exact intersection and got absolutely pulverized by a speeding dump truck. The impact threw his body right into the concrete base of the gas station sign. The old man didn't let me drive home alone. He was terrified for me. He escorted me all the way back to my neighborhood, making sure I didn't stop or talk to anyone else. When I got home, I collapsed. I didn't drive for a solid week. I just stayed in my room, staring at the walls, trying to convince myself I had just hallucinated the entire night due to exhaustion. I should have quit right then. I really should have. But poverty is a stubborn thing. We needed the money, and eventually, the terror faded into a dull anxiety. I went back to work, but I was paranoid. A few months passed. It was December. The city was still recovering from a massive, horrific tragedy. The ITC commercial building had caught fire a couple of months prior, and a lot of people had burned to death trapped inside. It was a dark cloud over the whole city. One evening, around 8 p.m., I was parked on the sidewalk of Hoingthuekang Street, standing around watching some older men play Chinese chess on a folding table. I had left my bike parked a few feet away. I was just killing time, minding my own business. One of the guys watching the game tapped my shoulder and pointed toward the street, grumbling that I had a customer waiting and I shouldn't ignore my job. I turned around and saw a young woman sitting side saddle on the back of my bike. She looked completely normal, an office worker wearing a nice blouse, dark slacks, and high heels, with her hair styled in those tight curls that were popular back then. She smiled politely, apologized for intruding, and asked if I could take her across the Calmette Bridge into District 4. I agreed immediately. 10,000 dong, which was less than $1 for a quick trip over the bridge. Easy money. I got on the bike and we headed toward the bridge. I was always a chatty driver, so I started making conversation, asking her why she was working so late. She politely replied that her office always had late hours. I asked her where her office was, and she gave me the name of the ITC building. The hair on my arms immediately stood up. I nervously chuckled, looking at her in the rearview mirror, and told her she must be mistaken, because that building had burned down a few months ago and nobody was working there. We were halfway up the steep incline of the Calmette Bridge. The wind was howling off the river. She looked at my eyes in the mirror. her face completely twisted into a mask of pure agony. "Oh my God, the fire is everywhere," she screamed, her voice completely unhinged, tearing right through my eardrums. "The smoke is so thick, I can't see the stairs. It's burning my skin. God, it's so hot. I can't run. I can't run fast enough." She was thrashing wildly on the back of the bike, screaming at the top of her lungs about the flames melting her skin. I lost my fucking mind. Pure primal terror took over. My hands jerked violently, twisting the handlebars. The bike fishtailed out of control, and we both went slamming down onto the hard asphalt, tumbling over and over down the slope of the bridge. I scraped the flesh off my arms and knees. I scrambled up, completely bloody and fueled by pure adrenaline, ready to scream at this crazy woman for nearly killing us. I spun around. The bridge was completely empty. A couple of other drivers who had been behind me pulled over to help me pick up my bike. They looked at me like I was insane. They asked me why I had suddenly started violently swerving left and right before throwing myself onto the pavement. I frantically asked them where the girl in the office clothes went. They just stared at me. They told me I had been riding alone the entire time. I limped home that night, dripping blood on my floorboards, and swore to Brianna that I was done. I promised her I would never, ever take a fare past 6 p.m. again, and I kept that promise for almost a year. I became religious about it. If the sun was down, the engine was off. But then, late in 2003, I messed up. I let my greed win one last time. It was around 5:30 in the evening, right during peak rush hour. The traffic near the Phu Lam Bridge was a nightmare. An old woman carrying a ton of groceries waved me down. She wanted to go to a deep alleyway in Bin Thon district. It was a long ride, and I knew it would push me past my 6 p.m. curfew, but the traffic was so bad, I figured I'd be stuck anyway, so I might as well make 20,000 dong out of it. I took the fare. The old woman was a gossip, constantly talking into my ear the whole ride. As we finally approached her neighborhood, it was already well past 6:30, and the sky was completely dark. She pointed out a pair of houses in her alley. She whispered that a few months ago, a massive gas canister had exploded inside, burning both houses to a crisp and killing a handful of people sleeping inside. I drove past the houses. The stench of charred wood and burnt plastic was still suffocating. The walls were nothing but blackened, skeletal remains. I dropped the old woman off deep in the alley, took my money, and immediately turned around to speed out of there. I hated the vibe of that place. As I was driving back toward the main road, my headlight washed over the front of the burned-down houses. Standing right in front of the blackened rubble, just inches from the curb, was a young girl. She was wearing a simple shirt, and her hair was tied back in a ponytail. Her head was bowed so low her chin touched her chest, and she was slowly, methodically waving her hand at me, hailing a ride. My stomach tied itself into a freezing knot. My instincts, the ones honed by the hospital and the bridge, screamed at me. I didn't even look at her. I gunned the engine and flew past her, bursting out onto the busy main road. I pulled over, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sitting on a parked bike nearby was an old driver, fast asleep with a newspaper covering his face. I frantically shook him awake and told him there was a customer waiting right inside the alley. The old man woke up, thrilled to get a fare, and immediately revved his engine. He drove into the alley. I stood there on the main road, safely under a street lamp, and watched him ride toward the girl. I saw him slow down as he approached her, and then, clear as day, I watched the girl slowly drop her hand, turn around, and walk straight into the pitch-black, abandoned ruins of the burned house, disappearing into the shadows. A few seconds later, the old man came tearing out of the alley, his face purple with rage. He threw his bike on its kickstand and marched up to me, threatening to beat my skull in for playing a cruel prank on him. I held my hands up, terrified, and swore to him that I wasn't joking, that I saw a girl waving for a ride. In front of the burned house, the old man stopped dead in his tracks. All the color drained from his face. He looked at me, his eyes wide with genuine horror, and asked me if she was standing in front of the ashes. When I nodded, he started shaking. He whispered, his voice cracking, that one of the victims of that fire was a 16-year-old girl from the countryside who had just moved to the city. He told me that ever since the fire, the night drivers had been reporting a young girl standing in that exact spot, trying to hire a bike to take her back to her home village in the Mekong Delta. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't wait around. I jumped on my bike and I drove home faster than I ever had in my life. From that second until the day I finally sold that bike in 2010, I never broke my rule again. I didn't care if it was a holiday. I didn't care if a customer offered me $100. If the clock struck 6, my engine was dead. Wow, I didn't realize how long I've been talking. My bad, guys. I get lost in my own head sometimes, but getting this out, it honestly feels like I can finally breathe a little easier. Thank you for your patience. It really means the world to me. For the drivers out there, hustling in the dark, watch your back. And if a passenger ever tells you they don't want to go home, don't ask them where they really belong. Stay safe, all right?